Good morning, church. Many years ago, I was alone at home, and Guin had a standing thing that she would do on this particular day. Every week, it would be the same thing. And a friend of hers who knew her routine called the house. And she said, could I please speak to Guin? Well, a bit of background. This woman was extremely pretty. She was a model. She could have walked into the Dallas Cowboy cheerleader team and probably walked right on it. And I said, well, Guin's not here. And she said, well, maybe you can help. I'm just around the corner. I'll be there in a few minutes. Well, I grabbed everything I could. I was in a study program, really intense study, grabbed my books, got into my car, drove in the opposite direction of which I thought she would be coming, looked up into the rearview mirror, and sure enough, there was a car coming around the corner. I'm not sure whether there was any bad intention there. I just did not want to be in a situation where I should not be. When we look at young Joseph, and we look at his life, and we see him coming into this house, Potiphar is the captain of Pharaoh's guards. He is a high-ranking officer. Everything is going really well in his life. And so he can afford to go and buy at auction a young Jewish slave boy who is only 17 years old and bring him into his house. Because you see, Potiphar is a very busy man. He's got a lot of things to do. And this young boy, Joseph, comes into the house and he starts to take care of everything. In fact, he knew more of what was going on in Potiphar's house than Potiphar did. And Potiphar admits it. Potiphar would say, all I see is the bread is put in front of me and I don't even know where it's coming from. Potiphar did not even know his net worth. All he knew was that his house was doing really well, his fields were also doing well, and I imagine his career was doing very well. And so as his career started to take off, and he got more and more busy and spent less and less time at home, this young 17-year-old boy that Ben read to us a short while ago, he started to grow in stature and become very pleasing to look at and physically very strong. And so he's not 17 anymore, probably. We learned from Genesis 41 that he is out of prison and in Pharaoh's house when he's 30. So somewhere in between, something happened that wasn't good. But what I do notice about Joseph, and something you need to know about the Egyptian women, they were strikingly beautiful. And somebody like Potiphar could have married somebody who was very pretty. And Pharaoh, if you think Potiphar's wife may have been beautiful, Pharaoh's wife was probably really, really beautiful. But I don't see anything happening later on in Joseph's life in the next household that is helping to run. Because he's learned from the experience over these years. And so when you look at this and you listen to what's going on in his life, understand this. It's okay for a donkey to kick you in the face on the chin one time. But if that same donkey kicks you in the same place a second time, something's wrong. You know, we have things that happen in our lives, and they happen so that we may learn from them. And what I want to talk to you today about is a faith that's a sustainable faith, a functional faith, a faith that will work in no matter what circumstance you're in. And we're not going to get this if we just have a cursory glance. I want us to dissect how a faith is tested. I want you to see the attraction, the allurement that entices your faith. I want you to see the adversities that tries to strike at your faith. And I want you to see the awfulness, the awful depths that our faith is sometimes pulled through as we are given and formed this functional faith. For some, our faith is going to get really strong. And for others, our faith is going to become really weak. And so read with me the text. Let's look at the first few verses, verses 7 through verse 12. And look at this allurement first. And you'll see, right off the bat, you'll see this request coming, and then you'll hear the refusal, and then you'll hear or understand the roughhousing that's in these verses. And after a time, here's the request, and after a time, tell you what, while we have the text open, look at verse 7. Do you see the word time? Now look down to verse 10. Do you see the phrase day after day? And then look at verse 11. Do you see the idea of one day? See, the devil is very, very good at this. He is going to take his time. He's very patient, just like God is very patient, not wanting any of us to be lost. So the devil is very patient, wanting to get each one of us. Here comes a request. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." It would have sounded like honey dripping off the honeycomb. Her eyes would have been so seductive. And you say, what an awful woman. But now listen, put yourself in that house. Her husband's never at home. This young man's always there. No telling what could have happened in her life. Maybe she had a miscarriage. Maybe there was nobody to help her in her down times. And then this young man, and Potiphar should not have let him in that house. He's in the parts of the house where she is, and they're bumping shoulders. And probably as a young boy, Joseph was very alone, and he was looking for somebody like a mother figure to comfort him. You know, there were things going on there. If you just read into what was happening, you would see that it could happen. Maybe you can think of somebody who every week travels for their work, and they're away from home for 3 days at a time. And they go to the same place, maybe 100 miles away, where nobody knows them. Nobody will ever know what's happening here. And there's the same lady and the same guy in the same motel. She's all alone. He's all alone. Maybe one day at the continental breakfast, one of them asks, "How do you make waffles?" You know, just innocent. And then the eyes start moving. And then eventually, the request comes. You know, it really helps in your faith if you know how this is going to work. It's going to start. There's going to be an allurement. And it does not need to be an attractive thing. Sometimes the devil sets a very negative trap for us, where things are going horrible in our lives, where we want to be, where we're mad at somebody who hurt us, or where we want to gossip about someone. So here's the request. And then here comes the refusal. And how do we know it's the refusal? But he refused. You got that? This is the refusal. Verse 8. But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am." And if you don't understand that, you need to read the first few verses of Genesis chapter 39, where it explains that he didn't even know what his net worth was. He just saw this bread being put in front of him. And so he literally was trusting Joseph with everything, because he saw the Lord was blessing him. "There's none greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me, except you, because you are his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and what? And sin against God." See, that's it. Now, can you put yourself again in her shoes? She's putting herself out there. I mean, she's vulnerable. Her pride and everything is out there. And here comes Joseph, and he's just stomping all over it. He's not even being tactful. I mean, he's really putting her off the way he's talking right now. At least you would think he is. Verse 10. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her. So it sounds like the refusal is still intact. To, number one, lie beside her, or number two, to be with her. She's enticing him on every level. It's now full out. She's put it out there, and she really keeps asking and keeps asking. And then finally, he has the roughhousing. This force. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men were there, that's key, right? Joseph had been very careful to this point, but she's been very patient. She's waiting for the right ingredients to come about. None of the men of the house were there in the house. She caught him by his garment. Does Joseph ever get into trouble before because of his garment? Seems like that multicolored garment is what got him into trouble in the first place, right? Okay. Saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Just from that verse 12, we can probably preach sermons for the rest of the year. There's so much going on in every single verse here. A functional face is going to face allurement. It's going to face attractive appeals or satanic snares. You can hear the request very clearly. You can see the refusal there, and you can see the roughhousing. What happens here? What is going on? What is the dynamic? He's just got a promotion. He's vulnerable to what's happening at the moment. Who would blame him? He's a young man. And she can say, listen, nobody will ever know. But there's two scriptures I want you to remember, both in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13, and Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3. When you look at the first one, when you look at Hebrews chapter, let me just get it right. For some other reason, my brain just tripped on me. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13 and 13, verse 4. I don't know if I said the wrong scriptures. I think I was in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13, which is encouraged all day long, that we may be encouraged. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13, and no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to his eyes, to whom we must give account. And then if you take Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, you'll see that the marriage bed must be kept holy, must be kept sacred. So yeah, you have Joseph, he's not married yet. What would have happened if he had this affair with this lady? Before they were married, before he eventually would get married, he would have been committing fornication against his future wife. Do you understand that? I remember when Guin and I were engaged, we had one of those long engagements, including a stint during a time of war. And so we were really missing each other. And we made a pact with each other that we would be pure. We'd kept ourselves pure up until this day. We would be pure when we got married. And it wasn't easy. But if I cheated with my future wife before I was married, I would have been committing fornication or future adultery against my wife. Do you understand what God is saying? Folks, the marriage bed must be kept holy. We cannot worry about the peripheral things in this country when we have 40% of children being born outside of marriage. We need to get back to the basics where God really is. And see how God really sees this. See the allurement. Once you see how God sees this, you will know when to say, no, this is not going to happen. You will know when you say, I can't commit this wickedness and I cannot sin against God, because you'll understand it. And so we have that, first of all, the allurement. And every one of us is going to face this. What we have today on our billboards 50 years ago would have been considered pornography. What we have in our homes today are young children who are a click away from things that Joseph was facing when he had to run out of the room. Our children are a click away from a very, very early age. And you know what's keeping them safe? Their judgment. Their judgment, because nobody will ever know. Nobody will ever find out. Their self-discipline. We have a generation growing up right now that are growing up stronger than any of us ever had to grow up. Spiritually, they are really strong. Yes, spiritually there are some who are very, very weak also. But there are a lot who are very strong. And then we have the adversities. There's going to be a time when temptation isn't just going to be easy. It's going to really take you down. You're going to struggle with this thing, and you're going to wrestle with it. In verse 13 through to verse 19, we read this. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled out of the house, she called out to the men of the house and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. I learned in Africa that if you have a wild animal chasing you, you have one shot. You can't outrun this animal. But if you will get rid of a jacket or a shoe or whatever you can do while running full speed, do it. Because there's a chance that for a split second, that animal is going to attack whatever you left. But that's the only chance you've got. That lion or whatever, it's still coming. And you better get somewhere where it can't get hold of you. Somewhere tight or somewhere where... And so he does this. He's out, but she's like a brute animal. She's got something. And so she thinks, split second, maybe she thought about this ahead of time. What would happen? She calls out and she says, she gets an ally here. This guy that Potiphar brought in here, who's now your boss, because pretty soon Joseph became overseer. A Jewish slave boy became overseer over everybody. He's laughing at you. He's laughing at us. He came into me to lie with me. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. As soon as he heard it, that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Verse 16, then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. What do you think was going through her head at that time? She's got this garment here. She's mad as can be. She's maybe a little bit scared. Will Potiphar believe this? Because this guy's running. He's the CFO of our company. Whose side is he going to take? But she's also really stewing. And she's rehearsing the story and she's seething. And so when he comes in verse 17, and she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as his master, there's a lot of as soon in this text here. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. There's a lot of things going on here. First thing I can see is that she clearly does not know what she owns and what she can control. She thought she owned this young slave boy. She thought she could control this young slave boy. And pay very careful attention to what I'm saying to you right now. This is important. This is very important. You will get into trouble every time that you don't understand what you own and what you control. I don't think there's anybody in prison right now that is there because they didn't mess up these two. They're in prison because they didn't understand what they owned and they didn't understand what they controlled, unless they're in prison because they were innocently charged with something they didn't do, as in Joseph's case. So we see that in verse 13. He left and he fled, so she didn't control him and she didn't own him. Number 2, verse 14, she gets allies. She calls the men of the house. She's got these allies. She's getting these accusations together, and it's really, really hard. And then there's the trap. Laid up his garment. She ensnared him. She's holding on to it. That's where the trap is set and it's sprung. And then number 4, she's lying. She's saying these things. And notice the truth and the lie. Notice how close they are to each other. It's a believable lie. And she's repeating the same lie. She just embellishes it ever so slightly to her husband as to those other men. But it's so close. And then there is the guilt. When he heard this, what she said, his anger was kindled against her. And so there's so many things going on. Have you ever been a victim of somebody else's viciousness? Can you remember a time when somebody attacked you because you were trying to do the right thing? I was a very young preacher, just my first year or so into ministry, when an elder brought up an accusation against me. And the accusation was that I had used the church telephone to make personal calls. And I'd accrued a debt of 400 rand, more than what it's ever been, because I was doing these long-distance calls. Well, I left it. I didn't do anything about it. But this elder continued, and he got an accusation and got one of the other elders to help him, and they found 20 accusations against the preacher. They brought it in. They gave it to me. I said, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I took it. I found the closest garbage can I could, and I threw it away, and I put a tape recorder in my office. And I found out that the elder that had accused me was conducting business in my office long distance. It's bad. Well, when I stopped that avenue, there was a young guy, a medical doctor in his family that I baptized in town. This elder would just walk into this man's business and say, "You probably don't mind me using the fax." And he would use the fax and send long-distance faxes, not realizing that I was in a class with both of them at that time. Eventually, they were both baptized, but it was rough. Sometimes, folks, you just got to keep quiet, and you just got to mind your own business, and you've got to take it. But it's not easy. See, you'll think that the attraction is over, that everything's going to go well now. But the devil's not through. Once the attraction is there, then the adversity comes in, and then comes the awfulness. Sin is not pretty. It's really ugly. And I know that I have many stories ready to share with you all right now, and you have many that you could share with me. It's bad. But for Joseph, it was about to become really, really bad. I counted the amount of times that from verses 20 through 23, just 3 verses, the word prison is mentioned. I counted 8 times that it's directly mentioned. The word prison, prisoner, prison warden. He's a prison. He's in prison. Look, if you would, with me from verse 20, 21, 22, 23. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Do you get the idea? He's not in a nice place, and he's not there because of something he did. He's innocent. That really makes it bad. Verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. I've seen these words, but, come about in the text. And now it comes around in a good way. But God is there. Verse 22, and the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. And so you can see here in the key points, you can see the prison, took him into the prison. You see there's the king's prison also. He's confined, he's in prison. And then we come with the words, but the Lord was with Joseph in verse 21 and showed him steadfast love and gave him honor. We also see here that in verse 22, that he's made the head prisoner, if you can be that way. Verse 22, he put him in charge of all prisoners. We see in verse 23 that he was successful. It actually says that, verse 23, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it to succeed. This is how sin works. It's the beautiful little flower that the bee attracts to it. The bee wants to have the nectar, but the flower wants to put the pollen on the bee so that the bee can go to the next flower. And there's the story of the birds and the bees, as simple as that. There's always going to be an attraction. There's always going to be that enticing. But there's going to be the adversities also. You're not going to just get to that pollen or that nectar very easily. And there's the awfulness of that pollen being stuck to you when you go around. That bee looks kind of silly, stuck with all that pollen wherever it's going. Better get rid of that pollen quickly. Let's go to the next flower. And so it just gets worse and worse and worse. But it can go completely the opposite way. This awfulness for Joseph actually turns to awesomeness. You get that? It could have gone the other way, but it was awesome. I'm thinking, I come and I die to myself and I'm buried with Jesus in the baptistry, and I come out fully prepared to walk a new life. But then the devil has not finished with me. Because God has left me in this world. And instead of me being home instantly, I'm in this prison. I'm in a world where nobody can understand what's going on. I've got to raise children in a cesspool. But yet, it's actually awesome when you see what's happening. Every now and then, I get a phone call from many states away from a man who called me one day and he described what was going on. Not only was his marriage over, but friends had actually had pictures to show him. And they laid the pictures in front of him of his beautiful bride in a compromising situation. It was the most traumatic experience he's ever been through. And he's been through some hard, tough times. He's a hard, tough man with a hard, tough career. He knows what danger is. Yet that was the most traumatic thing that ever happened. To this day, I don't know if his wife knew that there were pictures taken, that he went through this trauma. And so I helped both of them, and everything worked out, and the family's beautiful, and it's growing, and things are wonderful. And I got this message, and it was almost tearful, and Steve, I was worried, what's going on. And I had a really important other call to make, but I called him first. I said, how are you doing? And he started to talk, and he explained things to me. But it was a different person. It's a different conversation. He told me how people are calling him now that he's put his life together, and they're asking him about this, and he's helping them through. And he said this past couple of weeks, something very bad has happened to him. His sister called, said, I need to meet with you. I need to see you face to face. And so he met her on the highway, and his sister just looked at him. He said, I don't have this fantastic relationship with her, and I was wondering what's going on. And she said to him, I'm having an affair. And he told me the person who the affair is with, and I know that person. And I'm leaving my husband. In other words, I'm leaving your brother-in-law, and I'm going to make a life with this new man. So what do you think my friend said? You know how family will always back their relatives, right? You don't back the in-law or the son-in-law or you always back your family. This is what he said to his sister. I don't approve. I think it's wrong. I don't support you in this at all. But if you will work it out with your husband, I will be there every step of the way. Financially, I will pay for whatever needs to be paid. I'll put all my time, everything I have into helping you. And guess what? She's not divorcing. And he starts to reach out to his brother-in-law and is teaching his brother-in-law about baptism. So the next call I'll get, we wonder, isn't that great? Can't you see that? While the whole world is so upset about this happening in our country and that happening in our country, there's a group of people that say, you know what, there's something much more important. There are souls that need to be saved, and we're going to just fly under the radar, and we're going to be baptizing people left, right, and center. We're going to be making Christians. Our faith is going to get stronger, and we know where the devil's going to come from. We know how it's going to work. And we're going to be ready for it, and we're going to absolutely refuse to go that way. Folks, I want you to look at this message today. I want you to get just something out of it, just one thing that you can hold on to. Jesus is your rock. He's an anchor for your soul. Everything else is a big mess, but not Jesus. Jesus can help you through whatever. If you're ready to turn your life around, I'm not naive enough to think that the majority of people I'm speaking to today are not being tempted. I know it's tough to be in this world. It's really tough to be in this world. But we can overcome. Jesus will give us the equipment to overcome. If you need that strength, if you need the prayers of the church, please ask for the prayers of the church. However, if you need to be baptized, if you haven't held onto that anchor yet and you don't know what I'm talking about, please consider coming forward, being baptized right now, as together we stand and sing.